Joe Biden was regime changed by Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. Seymour Hersh just broke a bombshell story revealing the coup plot that Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer planned to remove Joe Biden. Barack Obama told Joe Biden directly that Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi got approval from Kamala Harris to invoke the 25th Amendment if Joe Biden didn't leave the race. The 25th Amendment allows the removal of a president with the approval of the vice president and approval of 2/3 of Congress. This directly contradicts the narrative from Democrat-controlled media that Joe Biden is some selfless leader who stepped aside for the good of the country. Genocide Joe Biden had no intention of stepping down. That's why the donors had to pause funds and they had to rally Democrat leaders to twist his arm and threaten him to leave the race. This story is very damning because it shows that Democratic Party voters have no say on who actually runs the country. A shadowy group of oligarchs do. Is this what saving democracy looks like? And what does it say about the Democratic Party that they do such drastic actions to remove Joe Biden because of a bad debate instead of the fact that he's funding and providing diplomatic immunity to a whole ass genocide? The Democratic Party has no problem with genocide. They just have a problem if you are bad at selling genocide. But I must admit, it is quite satisfying to see Joe Biden, of all people, be a victim of regime change.
What's poppin', my friends, my family? We are back again. Welcome to RBN. Nick at noon, Nick at anytime. What's poppin', my friends? Hope you guys enjoyed yesterday's show. Man, John Pang brought the heat yesterday. What a banger guest that we had yesterday. And we are back with another banger. I have a friend of the show, always great to have Fiorella Isabel on. We're going to discuss the Venezuelan elections we discussed yesterday, but there's so much, especially so much happened over the last 24 hours. We're also going to have Jose Luis, who will be joining us around top of the hour. He with Venezuela Analysis, who we had them on a few weeks ago, and it's the best time possible to have Venezuela Analysis on. And I wanted to focus largely on Venezuela, which we will today. I'm going to introduce my guest here soon. I just want to show you guys this, and I would love to get. Oh man, this website's fucking trash, isn't it? It's always funny. They always complain about print media dying, but then you go to their website and it's fucking horrible. This is why no one reads print media. But this is the story I was trying to pull up. You had Netanyahu, who gave a speech to Congress where he gave orders to American politicians that we're starting the war with Iran right now. We have Israel, who want never-ending conflict. So what do? They kill a top Hamas political leader and top mediator. So what happened to the Biden administration claims that Hamas wants peace, that Israel was negotiating in good faith while Hamas was the ones who were negotiating in bad faith? This is not only the message of the Biden administration, this is the message of the entire Western corporate media. Meanwhile, you have Israel that literally took out the lead mediator. How are you going to have peace in this situation, which we know why is not the goal? That, of course, is not the goal. The goal is for never-ending conflict. But I want to bring my guests in. I'm very interested in hearing Fiorella opinion on this as well. We have amazing journalist who does great work with RT. You also do great work on election integrity. Welcome to RBN once again, Fiorella Isabel.
Nice to see you, Nick. Nice to see you. Yeah, Nick. So much going on, Nick. You mentioned it as well. Actually, before here, I was just doing an interview myself to somebody else, and it's crazy. I just want to say on that, I've been following the story. I was just on Red Pill. It's a show produced out of Lebanon the other day, and we were talking about Israel's attack on the Golan Heights and how it was Israel, without a doubt, killing these children because they're the only ones that kill children all the time, endlessly. And they were trying to paint it as it was Hezbollah. It was Hezbollah. It was Hezbollah. And I was discussing how this is going to get out of hand because Israel cannot fight a war on three fronts. And one of them I wouldn't consider a war. One of them, obviously, we know in Gaza is a genocide. They're not accomplishing any of their military targets, any of their military objectives. They're not eradicating Hamas. They failed. They have been exposed as a paper tiger. Israel is not the Israel that people thought they were a year ago. Now, nobody likes Israel. A lot of people have completely shifted the perspective. Anybody defending Israel at this point is looked down as insane and heartless and soulless. And so now we have this whole situation where Israel has gone and attacked southern Beirut and killed children and killed Hezbollah leadership. And then they have also attacked Syria. They have attacked as well and killed and murdered the leader of one of the main leaders of Hamas, whose whole entire family was killed, and Ismail Hede. And his whole entire family was killed. And then he was in Tehran for the inauguration. And of course, they killed him there as well. Meanwhile, the United States also put out strikes in Iraq. And all of this is happening, Nick, in the face of the fact that the US and their allies are trying to do everything they can to discredit the elections in Venezuela. And you have a lot of Americans coming out and basically saying, oh, yes, we need to bring democracy to Venezuela. Venezuela needs to be free. Meanwhile, look what our US military is doing, our US government, because these are our US weapons, the US defense industry, and they are just going about and killing people left and right everywhere.
Yeah, this is that was such a great breakdown. And what's happening in Venezuela, which we'll get to here very soon, is exactly why I laugh in the face of liberals, and I have over the last few years, to put January 6th hysteria as they are denying elections, as they support the real violent insurrectionists. I mean, the opposition in Venezuela burn people alive. They play for keeps. Like, it's not the drunk rednecks who want to have a tour of a Capitol. Like, these are people who play for keeps, and these are the people that progressives. Bernie had a predictable tweet, as we always knew he would, supporting the opposition. AOC supported Juan Guaido. The left in the United States, I would say ignorant, but it's almost purposely ignorant because they're doing the will of the establishment. But we will get to that on the side. I just have a few more. I don't want to talk about the Hamas leader too much, but it's such a giant story, and it's very revealing, like everything. Of course, the media is not going to give you paint the full story of this. The media, as I mentioned earlier, have been painting Hamas as the bad faith negotiators. The Biden administration will come out every day and say, Hamas need to accept the proposal on the ceasefire. And then Israel come out the next day, what are you talking about? We're not doing no ceasefire. Then the next day, the Biden administration like, Hamas need to agree with the ceasefire. Israel, like, we don't know what they're talking about. And then Israel kills the lead mediator of the ceasefire deal, essentially killing it.
We have to talk about the ceasefire talks. That's the most important thing. Now, what Israel has just done is killed the person, one of the key people they were negotiating with. Now, if you are very serious about a ceasefire and a ceasefire agreement, a negotiated one, you don't kill the people you're supposed to be talking to.
Now, think about the implications of this. You have Israel, like, with the guidance of the West, that is normalizing political assassinations, destroying, robbing the sovereignty of other states, the same way they normalizing torture, the same way they're normalizing sexual assault. We have the Zionist regime that's literally taking humanity back, the base that the ruling class had. The ruling class disagree with torture not on moral basis. They disagree with torture because it wasn't a reliable way to get information. So they figured, oh, we can take the PR victory. Let's pretend we banned torture. Israel, no, we don't care about none of that. Torture is okay. Mass sexual assault is okay. Political assassinations are okay. Anything else you want to add before I get to my last part, and then we get to Venezuela? Anything else you want to add, Fiorella, before I continue?
Well, just the fact that Israel can kill with impunity, and again, nobody is questioning the except people like us. But I mean, the majority of the politicians in the U.S. and even the majority of Americans that are so outraged at the fact that Maduro is president don't seem to have too much of a problem with what Israel and the US continue to do. And that seems something that needs to be pointed out if we're ever going to get past this whole thing, because it was a lot of people who say, they're against the globalist elite, that they're against the deep state. And when it comes to, for example, Russia, Ukraine, for some reason, any sort of country that's close to Europe, they can see it. But when we talk about the Middle East, or when we talk about Latin America, and you throw in the word communism or socialism, they sort of put on these blinders and they don't listen to anything else that is said. And then, of course, in the Middle East, you have the whole, terrorism, right? Iran must be a terrorist entity. Lebanon, Hezbollah, they're terrorists too. So they get those blinders on. And it is that way that the US has been so propagandized, of course, as we all say, the most propagandized country in the entire world. And I think it's important to point out the different reactions to these different events, but events that are, after all, connected in the greater scheme. When we talk about a sort of potential global conflict that we're seeing, all of these events happening at around the same time are a result of the same people. The same people are pushing these theaters in the various these wars in the various global sectors that exist today.
And of course, as you were mentioning, how everything connects, of course, the opposition in Venezuela are hardcore Zionists, the same way that Bolsonaro hardcore Zionists, the same capitalist class traders who side with the CIA in the West. They're always doing the bidding of Israel. Always, it's very weird how everything connects in that way. Everything ties back to the United States and the Zionist entity. And like you said earlier, I love what you said in your initial rant, talking about how Israel is a paper tiger is a common theme that we've been hitting on this show. And this assassination, despite what the Zionist cowards believe, is a sign of weakness. And I'll let this tweet speak for itself, because I think Mohammed Shihada had a great tweet here. A big shout out to them. Assassinated Hayania, I'm probably mispronounced that, is an empty victory image that reeks of desperation and malevolence. He was a politician, not a military leader. Israeli media themselves admit his killing will have a minimal effect on Hamas operations, but it will dramatically impact internal power dynamics. So the most important part here is how this will have no impact on Hamas military capacity. The claims that the Likud party and mainly the far-right fascists in Israel, I shouldn't even say that. Honestly, everyone was making. Bernie was saying we need to defeat Hamas. Everyone was saying we should defeat Hamas. So the claim that Israel could defeat Hamas, as you exposed earlier, was never true. And the fact that they have to do this proves everything. Right? Anything else you want to add, Fiorello?
Well, I just think what he said is so important because, as you mentioned, it's not going to affect Hamas's ability to defeat Israel militarily or Israel's ability to defeat Hamas. What it is doing, Iran has already said that they will go after Israel. That's what it's doing because they targeted somebody inside a foreign country. And they have done this before, of course. And Iran has been very, very hesitant to react emotionally, almost too hesitant, according to some, right? Lebanon as well. They haven't gone out and say, oh, tit for tat, you kill our civilians, we're going to kill yours. Similarly to how we've seen this situation develop, for example, between Russia and Ukraine, they have shown a lot of restraint. But I think you're going to be seeing, at the very least, responses from Hezbollah, responses from Tehran, and you're going to see those responses be greater than they have been, but they're also going to be military focuses. I do not see that they're going to try to go in a tit for tat way in terms of civilians, because that's just not how they operate. And that's something to be said as well.
Yeah, well said. And this is what Israel wants. This is the regional war, the fight for greater Israel that these fascists talk about. And this is what Benjamin Netanyahu openly said at the address, that one of the greatest acts of treason, as I explained, when he spoke to Congress with the approval of Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and Republican leadership Mike Johnson as well. The biggest act of treason to have someone who literally have an arrest warrant by the ICJ. So obviously I can make my radical leftist critiques on how genocide is bad. You know how us crazy leftists are. we condemn genocide, but we're not even talking about a radical critique. I'm using the institutional critique. The institutions condemned him. You know how fucked you got to be for the institutions to condemn? So the institutions condemned him, and he was still allowed to speak at Congress. The highest act of criminal treason I can think of in modern times by our Congress. And this is what he said, wanting Americans to send their sons and daughters to fight a future war with Iran, because there's no way Israel can win that alone.
In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization.
That's the pro-war Iran pitch, as they mass execute children, babies, rape prisoners as they conduct political assassinations, which is interesting. I saw a lot of people bring up this analysis. I do think it's interesting how they was able to have they had a pinpoint precision missile that was controlled, that was guided into the room where this Hamas leader was at, in a very pinpoint, precise assassination. Meanwhile, when they got killed Hamas members in Gaza, they drop in 1,000-pound bombs because they have no idea where the Hamas leaders are at, apparently. The inaccuracy is a choice. The last headline I'm going to read, and I'll pass to you, and then we get to Venezuela, because they get what they want. Like you said, to back up what you said, Fiorella, unlike the missile showing, the weapons display that happened in April, it was a glorified fucking fireworks show between Iran and Israel in April when they exchanged bullets before. I'm assuming, and I think you had the same assumption as well, it's not going to be the same this time. I think Israel crossed the line, and honestly, it's embarrassing for Iran to have this happening. So they have to respond strongly, and I think they will. We see. I was wrong last time, to be clear. I thought it was going to respond strong last time, but I think things are different this time. This is Iran raising the red flag of revenge on the dome of this mosque here. So I'll pass to you for your last thoughts on this before we get to Venezuela. This is Iran promising revenge, but once again, I thought they was going to do it last time, so hey, it was whatever. Fiorella, any last thoughts?
Yeah. So the issue is with Iran, it's like they understand that if they respond, this will escalate into a more global conflict. And this is what the West wants. This is what the United States wants. This is what Israel wants. They have been very, very hungry for war with Iran. You've heard it from John Bolton. You've heard it from JD Vance. You've heard it from these people. They want to go after Iran. So Iran, any response from Iran, just like any response from Russia, right, with all these violations, all these red lines being crossed, is going to be perceived and made, and they're going to run with this narrative as a very tyrannical, autocratic, non-democratic, crazy Iranians going after the US, going after Israel, going after, you know, the Western allyship. That's how it's going to be perceived no matter what they do. So they need to make a decision as to whether that even matters anymore, because no matter what they do, it's going to be perceived this way. But the United States and Israel both want the excuse of an attack by Iran in order to say, well, now we need to go after Iran. And that's precisely how they have to sort of walk this line, where if they do something that the US can and Israel can both use as a reason to go to war with Iran, a full-on war, then they will take that. And so it is a measure between being kind of goaded into war versus like just achieving your military objectives and not allowing these sort of, I would say, these attempts to get them riled up, to get them to emotionally react. And that's something that I've seen also happen in the Russia-Ukraine theater, where we're seeing the same things by Ukraine and NATO, these same attacks against, for example, Crimeans on a beach, and seeing what is Russia going to do now? Oh, we're sending our military drills. We're sending diplomats. We're sending delegations to the South China Sea. What is China going to do? It's these ways to try to get people to react into a point of no return.
Yeah, well said. And like you said, regarding Iran showing restraint, which I think China and Russia showing great restraint as well. My analysis, and I think it's fair to say that Nicolas Maduro has done a great job managing Western aggression against his state. He has done a great job not retaliating against the United States and against leaders who sold out to the United States, like many of the Southwestern countries who support his coups. And there's more hot-headed factions that wanted Maduro to be more on the offensive. But what Maduro did was very smart. It was very passive, but by refusing to respond, by having a pacifist approach, it was like, hey, man, you guys, it's clear that the United States is trying to fuck with us. It's clear that we're not doing anything. It's clear the United States have a alternative motive, and that's shown through the years of how Maduro has been managing this conflict. And I'm not saying he did perfectly, but try managing a country when the strong, most powerful empire in human history levies sanctions on you. We have a country where we have Skid Row and we have failed cities, we have failed communities, and who's sanctioning us? That's not my only thing. I am never saying these leaders are perfect. I'm not living in these countries. Who am I to say these leaders are perfect or imperfect? I know one thing. These countries are being sanctioned, and he is still keeping this shit running. We can't keep our country running without the sanctions. So I will pass it to you very vague. I got quite a few things to cover. We also have Jose Luis from Venezuela now to join us on top of the hour. That should be interesting as well. But I want to pass it to you very broadly. Why do you think there is? I ask you this: what is the biggest misconceptions about the Venezuelan elections, and how do they compare to the United States elections? I'll start there.
Well, I would say that the biggest misconception is just assuming that because Maduro is going to have a third term, because Maduro is of a socialist ideology, and because Venezuela is a socialist country, that's the label that it's been given. That means that this is a very autocratic, non-democratic election, and that is simply not the case. There are many parties in Venezuela. There are other leftist parties, there are other moderate parties. There is also the majority that we see most of the time in dealing with is the far right party, the party of course, Maria Corina Machado, who is behind the scenes the puppet master of Gonzalez, because Gonzalez is extremely elderly. He's not going to be running the country if he ever got into a position to do so. And he has a very, very, very disturbing background of working with CIA linked entities. So he's not some sort of just grandpa that's just like innocent. Like, he worked with like death squads, and he is linked to just this entire background of a very, very much far right / neocon Western sanctioned violence. And when you talk about Venezuela's elections, a lot of people are on the left are focused on, well, look, like, the Venezuelan elections are great because Maduro is great and the people of Venezuela have come out in huge numbers and supported him, which is good. But it's also good to talk about the technical aspect of these elections. The fact that these elections are conducted in one day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The fact that these elections have ID in multiple ways, not just by the ID document, but also fingerprint verification that must be also stamped on another paper to verify you're only voting once. The fact that these machines are electronic machines, but they're not connected to the internet, unlike in the US, which they are, which is why they're hackable. And the fact that these machines are more like a cash register in terms of how they work, meaning you make a choice and you get a paper ballot, and then you put this paper ballot into a box, and these two have to match. We don't have that either. And also the fact that there are audits, random audits of 54% of the machines, and that there are audits before, during, and after the election, which includes the parties of every single faction that is running. So, for example, if the parties do have an issue, they have to bring about these actas and say, okay, here you go. This is where I see a discrepancy. Let's take a look. And they haven't done that. The opposition hasn't done that. They haven't done that. They didn't do it before. They didn't do it after or during. So now people are waiting to see if the opposition will actually has a case, because so far they've just been throwing out numbers on WhatsApp groups or have been, just violently reacting to this. But the thing is, this is a different moment to the Guaido situation. During the Juan Guaido situation, they called Juan Guaido the victor before the election even happened. This time around, the election has happened, and the US and Venezuela were mediating as to what would happen if Venezuela conducted an election, right? And they said, well, if Venezuela conducts an election, things might go better for Venezuela in terms of the sanctions. But it seems like US is once again pulling the rug and not allowing that, because they're not going to take away the sanctions as if there's a Maduro victory. Their whole preface is, if there's a Maduro victory, there's not going to be that means that the elections are not valid. And they had planned this since before the election in Miami. The opposition had already said, if Maduro wins, we're going to say there's fraud. They had already said that. And they've been using this Edison exit poll that is linked to the CIA network of media groups, including Radio Europe, Radio Free Liberty, and Radio Free Asia, and Voice of America, and a bunch of these that we know have spewed lie after lie on US regime change interventions, have supported color revolutions. And all of this is all an entire plan to push doubt, not just in the Venezuelan people and the opposition, but also, of course, the entire world of people who are not politically educated and simply see these polls that are Western polls or US polls or polls funded in Venezuela by the opposition that say that the Edmundo Gonzalez should have won and Maduro should have lost. And therefore, these results aren't valid.
Amazing analysis as always. That's why I was blessed to have you joining us today. We also have an amazing guest. Fiorel, I know you're short on time. Let me know how you're doing on time. I think you got another 15 minutes or so. But I'm going to introduce this guest from Venezuela Analysis. We had them on a show, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and it was a great episode. It was great meeting and talking with you guys for the first time. And this first time I got to meet, I believe, Jose Luis. Correct me if I'm getting that incorrect, but we got Jose join us on RBN from Venezuela Analysis. Great timing as always. Thank you for joining us on RBN.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for providing this coverage, because as we know, the truth is difficult to get out there sometimes, especially when there is a regime change effort ongoing, happening right now. I caught the end of that there. It's good to be here and talk about this, and also Latin America more broadly, right? Because what's happening in Venezuela is often a script that is repeated elsewhere in the region. So I think it's important to pay attention, because who knows where else they can try to engage in this imperialist tactics to try to subvert the will of the people, to subvert democracy and the construction of socialism.
Yeah, well said. And that's the only thing that's my main focus, is getting to the truth, because we're so gaslit in America. I'm a victim of American education. You guys can tell how I pronounce words sometimes. But we are constantly bombarded with misinformation. So that's what I want. I just want the truth. And I know from my experience, just living in America, I grew up during the Iraq War. George W. Bush Jr. was the person who radicalized me. I know that whatever the United States State Department say, assume it is a lie. And I start that the opposite is true, and I navigate from there. And from Venezuela, when it comes to Venezuela, China, and Russia, I try my best to figure out what's true, because so much propaganda. And that's why I have many people that report from Moscow. I have Chinese reporters on. I have reporters like Fiorella who travel the world. That's why it's great to have you on, because I want to know the truth about Venezuela. You know what I mean? Not sunshine and rainbows. I just want to know what the United States is lying to me about, because I hate being lied to. As a child, there's nothing pisses me off than when a grown-up lied to me. Tell me the truth. So, Jose, what is your feeling, your perspective of what's going on the ground, the mood of the people? I did my coverage yesterday where I said Nicolas Maduro defeated the CIA coup, because that is what it appears what happening. Is that accurate? What is your analysis on things? And Fiorella, I'll pass it to you on the same thing. I want to get your perspective before you had to get out of here. But go ahead, Jose.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, today I'm wearing my Truth is Subversive Hugo Chavez t-shirt.
Oh, I like it. I like it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm relying on the information that's coming from my colleagues in Venezuela. So I'm based in Mexico City. I kind of do the international coverage of Venezuela and Latin America, but I want to highlight their work. They've had some very long days, very long nights covering this before the election, on election day, and obviously afterwards. And we did a live stream with some of my colleagues, with Sira Pascual Marquina, Ricardo Vaz, and Andreina joined us a day earlier. And they've all been telling us the situation on the ground. So obviously what we're seeing is a repetition of the insurrectionist tactics. I think it would be correct to call this an attempted coup, to use violent regime change methods to try to, as we say in Spanish, calentar las calles, right? To heat up the streets, to provoke this kind of instability, to destabilize the government, to try to see if you can provoke a rupture in the armed forces. Thankfully, in Venezuela, this is a decades-long process. They've consolidated control within the armed forces. We won't see what we saw in Bolivia, for example, unfortunately, in a couple of years ago now, in 2019, the coup d'etat there, where we saw the armed forces break. Importantly, we've seen the defense minister, the head of the armed forces, Vladimir Padrino, say, no, we are with the Constitution. We are with the democratically elected government. And so part of what they're doing is to kind of transmit this narrative, right? I overheard Fiorella talking about, these U.S. polling firms, these U.S. Linked exit polls talking about how the only legitimate result was going to be Edmundo Gonzalez winning. Obviously, they underestimate the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, the great patriotic poll, the coalition that runs in this election. They underestimate their capacity, the very enduring support that exists for the socialist project in Venezuela with the most adverse circumstances. We have to remember that Venezuela is under a brutal, murderous economic sanctions regime imposed by the United States, sustained by the United States, which makes things very difficult. But there are still people who are working, of course, towards the socialist horizon there in Venezuela. So what we're seeing with the opposition right now is a repeat of some tactics we've actually seen before in Venezuela. They're called guarimbas, which is basically trying to take over roads, set up blockades, burn tires, engage in violence. In past incidents, we're talking 2013, 2014, 2017, it was terrible violence. They burned people alive on the streets, right? They hung wire across the road trying to decapitate people. They would threaten people with handguns to give them money, or they weren't allowed to cross. It was very, very difficult times in Venezuela. And that's what they were trying to repeat. But it looks, and this is the important thing, it looks like they're not successful in kind of gaining that momentum. It looks like the situation is under control as it stands today, July 31st at noon Central Time, right? The situation can obviously change, and we need to continue to pay attention to it, keep our eyes on Venezuela. But one thing I would say is also not to overstate what's happening, because that's what they want. They want to convince the world that, oh, this is a terrible authoritarian regime. I was really troubled, not surprised, but bothered that Amnesty International put out this video saying we have to protect the right to protest, as if the police are repressing peaceful protests. When they have a peaceful protest, they're free to do what they like. There is guaranteed rights in Venezuela. The Constitution in Venezuela is amongst the most progressive in the world. But when you engage in these guarimbas and these violent protests, when you're trying to engage in regime change, yes, of course, the security forces are going to come out and try to protect constitutional order. That's their job. But they're trying to characterize it as if, it's repression against peaceful demonstrators. It's absurd. Like I said, my colleagues on the ground have been reported that things are calm. The situation is somewhat normal. Stores are starting to reopen and things like that. So we'll see how things go. It's very important to continue to pay attention to what's happening. But as far as things are today, this coup attempt, at least for the moment, appears to have been subdued, if not defeated.
Fiorella, I want to pass it to you. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that assessment in terms of what the situation is now. And I think it's important to highlight that, because what we're seeing, something different here than during the Guaido time, is the emergence of Elon Musk and his powerful army of dog barking idiots online that have been pretty much posting fake videos or videos that have been manipulated or are from 2017 during the Guarimbas then, and are not legitimate videos pertaining to what's going on now, in an attempt to make Venezuela look chaotic, destabilized, and going along with the hashtag of save Venezuela from Maduro, save Venezuela from this, dictator. Simultaneously, of course, we have a very awful election system in the United States. We don't have a democracy in the US. And look what our government is doing around the world. Yet, of course, Elon Musk is so hyper focused. And you had Javier Milei from Argentina claiming victory for the opposition before the results even came out. And then, of course, you have on top of that the fact that these are pro-Zionist entities as well, with Milei, with Maria Corina Machado, and the opposition, the far right opposition at least, and then Elon Musk. And you have this attempt to make Venezuela look like it needs saving. And it's a bunch of American accounts commenting, saying that Venezuela needs to be helped in some form or fashion without knowing absolutely anything about Venezuela or even where it is on a map. And it's really frustrating to have to fight against that, because this is new. We didn't have this before to the level we have it now in terms of social media. And he's literally a technocrat, billionaire, and he has a lot of pull into how some people think and the way they view things. And here he is endorsing the opposition, and not just that, he's endorsing a coup, an intervention in a foreign country in favor of a very troubling, intelligence-backed group of people, and really pushing a country to have no national sovereignty, which is the majority that most of these countries want. And so I find it very disturbing. And I think that needs to be pointed out in terms of what's going on in Venezuela, which is why it's so important to have people like Venezuela Analysis that are really giving us moment to moment, minute by minute updates on the situation on the ground. And a lot of my friends and comrades have been there just giving us the minute by minute too, showing us the thousands of people marching in support of Maduro to the Palacio de Miraflores in Caracas, and just completely going and saying that they want peace, they want restraint, they want things to continue to progress, and that they don't want to go back to the guarimbas of that time. And we should all be highlighting that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to add something there. I mean, there's a couple points. One, let's not forget, Elon Musk in the Bolivia coup that I referenced earlier actually tweeted out, "We will coup whoever we want." Right? That's how they think. That's how these neo-Nazis think. They think that they own the world. They can do what they like. And I would also add, this comment about Maria Corina Machado. She's been kind of gone through a PR exercise trying to clean her image up, but she's a far-right actor. She became famous because she opposed the recall referendum, calling it a fraud. That same kind of rhetoric she's using now, way back when George W. Bush was president and was received in the White House, right? And in fact, is very deeply tied to the Zionist entity. She actually called on Netanyahu to use an armed invasion of Venezuela to unseat Maduro. Her party has organic links to Likud. So we're not talking about, some pro-democracy activist. She was on TV recently talking about how, Israel has a right to do what it's doing. It's absurd, right? Like, these are the people that, they're trying to convince maybe uninformed people, liberals in the United States, that are democratic actors and all of that. No, they are far right. Marina Corina Machado in particular is a very dangerous person. Now, there's a lot of controversy over the fact that she was not allowed to run for president, but there's a reason for that. Venezuela's institutions blocked her from running because she is a coup plotter. She was a huge supporter of Juan Guaido, which Fiorella mentioned as well. And I think in a lot of ways, what we're seeing a bit is an attempt at Guaido 2.0. They've already declared that Edmundo Gonzalez is the president-elect, and that should be recognized. I think Peru has already recognized him as the president-elect, and so we're going to see this exercise again. We're going to pretend somebody who wasn't elected is the president, and it's very dangerous because there are repercussions to that, right? Venezuela's foreign assets, the most important one being Citgo, is at the brink of being broken up and sold away. It's really, literally stolen from the Venezuelan people. And that was made possible thanks to this whole fake interim presidency thing where they handed over the assets to the opposition. So there are consequences to this, which I think is also why it's so important to be able to communicate with people in English on these kinds of channels, because really a big part of the struggle is strengthening the anti-imperialist movement inside of the United States and Canada and Western Europe, of course, where we can actually debilitate, weaken U.S. imperialism from being able to carry out these things. I think that's really important. I have all the faith in the world in the Venezuelan masses and the Venezuelan working class to continue to resist, to continue to defend their project, but they also need people, their proletarian allies abroad, to also resist against the U.S. empire.
That's extremely important. Why do you guys think 95, 97% of my streams are foreign policy based. That should be your main focus. If you are a taxpayer in the most violent empire in human history, and you talking about the culture war, what are you doing? What are you doing? This should be your main focus. You should be calling out the countries that we get involved with, the people we sanction. Sanctions is an act of economic war. You should be calling out these corrupt elements in these countries that are teaming up with the CIA, because you were just talking about this, Jose, and I would love to get you guys' thoughts on this as well, because I've been explaining on the show, just reading and trying to educate myself more about the history of the Cold War, which is more like the capitalist retaliation to workers' uprising. It was more like a global class war instead of a vague term like a Cold War. And what happened, when the reason why you see a lot of these far right extreme elements, like you mentioned, the people who apologize for genocide, people who are like, think about who are the kind of people who will allow the CIA to meddle in your country. Like, instead of you trying to get the will of the people, think about the kind of person that will willingly side with a hostile foreign country to implement your agenda. I've heard opposition in Venezuela. I've heard opposition in all these countries that will call on sanctions for their own people. That we call for the United States to increase the sanctions. If you care about the Venezuelan people, why would you support the sanctions, for example? So I want to pass it to you guys for your thoughts, because this seems like a common theme, and I'll start with you, Jose. And this is generally a common theme in South America as a whole. It's much more rooted. I think me and Fiorella had a conversation about this before. It's much more rooted in class struggle, where the far right elements that team with the CIA are capitalist elements that want to crush the will of the working people. Is that a accurate analysis? What is your take on that, Jose?
Yeah, whenever time people talk about the Cold War, they forget that in the global South, it was a hot war. There was a lot of armed conflicts happening, a lot of guerrilla struggles here in Latin America, trying to bring national liberation, to break the yoke of imperialism. And so this idea that it was, a tepid is incorrect. To go back to Venezuela, it's a curious dictatorship that has an election with 10 presidential candidates on the ballot. Mostly we've talked about Nicolás Maduro and Edmundo González, but there were many others. And in fact, one of the others, Jose Brito, just the other day was in the National Assembly saying, you're calling for these protests again, but where are your children, Maria Corina Machado, right? They're somewhere safe. They're maybe in her expensive apartment or house in Caracas, or maybe they're abroad, right? These oligarchs don't keep their children inside the country. They don't put them on the front lines. No, who they send out there, the young kids to go and risk themselves. And there's actually documented cases of them being paid off so that they participate in these violent protests. And I think it's important to pay attention to that. He was a presidential candidate calling out Maria Corina Machado for saying, go out there and, engage in these violent protests. Well, where are your kids? Where are you? Are you putting out? We're talking about the fake news that was going out. There's this old video of her confronting one of the members of the Bolivarian National Guard, right? And again, trying to make it seem like she's on the front lines. Of course she isn't. And she's not going to, right? And if things get bad, she'll flee, like the rest of them have fled, like Leopoldo Lopez right now, who's in Spain living up the life. These people are the descendants of the owners of these countries during the colonial period. They're not, democracy activists. They are the oligarchy. They are the ruling class. They are connected to the transnational capital, and they are trying to act in the interests of transnational capital, not in the interest of democracy or anything of the sort.
And these are the right-wing elements that Bernie Sanders and AOC sides with. AOC follows Juan Guaido. Maybe she don't follow them, but last time I checked, she did. But Fiorella, I want to pass it to you on the same thought. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, and after this, I'll just get going and leave the floor to you both. But I just want to say, this what he mentioned is correct. I mean, the class of Venezuelans who support the opposition have their primary power in Miami. I mean, I grew up in Florida, South Florida as well, and I know very well, the Miami Cubans and the Miami Venezuelans and where they come from. And when we talk about what happens in Latin America as a whole, Venezuela is one of the few strong bastions that we have on the anti-imperialist sector that has managed to resist U.S. hegemony, U.S. sanctions for a long time. The United States has been trying to go after Venezuela since the time of Hugo Chavez. There's been attempted assassinations. There was the one in 2002 that was quickly this coup attempt that was resolved in 48 hours. and there were many other attempts against his life as well, because he brought in this idea of a government for the people, an actual government for the people, not the ideologies that the US espouses but really doesn't live up to. And you have this idea that came from, of course, Bolivar, Simon Bolivar, who was the guy who liberated the Americas, who liberated Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, and so on. And he had this plan for the Gran Colombia. And the problem is that Latin America fell right back into a new neo-feudal type of structure, with the supporting this idea of being vassals to the United States via the Monroe Doctrine. And so you had this existence of many Latin American countries, including the country where my family comes from, which is Peru. And the Lima Group, which is interesting, it's this group of basically US vassal countries that have tried to be the backyard of the United States and really have no national sovereignty for themselves and no actual effect in terms of being independent sovereign states. They have pretty much decided to not recognize Venezuela's results. We're talking about Uruguay, Paraguay, Peru, Chile. You have the audacity to come out and speak out against Venezuela's election when Chile has had a fascist president dictatorship, and you have these countries that have undergone coups. With Pedro Castillo, for example, that was a definite US backed coup. Southcom has been there. You have all of these countries that have been affected, and somehow they managed to be traitors to their own people. They managed to not have the ability to stand up for themselves and see that the wealth of Latin America, South America, Central America has been going out vastly into the West, into Europe, into the United States. And so for me, Venezuela is an important country to defend because it is a country that has expressed solidarity with the people who want this national sovereignty, who want independence from hegemony, who want to join BRICS, who want a different type of world. And along with Venezuela, of course, there's Cuba, there's Nicaragua, there is Honduras that has come out, and Mexico has even said something now. And I believe Lula finally said something in terms of saying that the election seemed fair. And so you have this sort of teetering situation in Latin America because they took Milei. They control Argentina now. The IMF and the United States have this control over Argentina. So that's why I think in this moment, Venezuela is so important for the US, not just for its gold, not just for its oil or its location geographically in the Caribbean, but also because of where we're going in the world as well. So that's all I want to say. Very nice to meet you as well, Jose Luis. And thank you,
it's
Nick.
always great to have you on, Fiorella. Make sure you guys follow Fiorella's work on RT. I saw you guys was live streaming on the Combo Couch again as well. Fiorella does fantastic work on the ground, always traveling. Always great to have you on and have you explain these complex issues. So thank you, Fiorella, anytime. And thank you for joining us.
See ya. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm glad that Fiorella brought up the positions of other leaders, because I was going to ask you guys about that, and I was really pleasantly surprised at AMLO. We're going to bring him up, but since you brought up Gabriel Boric of Chile, who has a history of far-right governments that were the victims of the United States coup, for him to side with the United States empire, I mean, when he first elected, we told you guys to be clear, he's center-left, like not to expect like anything radical. But it still is disappointing, even though we knew that coming in. So this is what he said, and I covered this a little bit yesterday. The Maduro regime must understand that the result it publishes are difficult to believe. And like I said yesterday, you finding the results difficult to believe is not evidence. I find it difficult to believe that Nancy Pelosi get reelected every 2 years. I find it difficult to believe that the American people voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I find it difficult to believe that anyone would vote for someone like Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that, well, I should say that's not evidence alone that the elections are fraudulent, right? That's what they say about Venezuela. Oh, he's Maduro, we hate Maduro. There's no way he could win. The election must be rigged. The same coming from the same liberals. And this, I'll pass it to you on this note here.
Actually, before
Go ahead, Jose. Go ahead.
Gabriel Boric. It's interesting that the position he's taken because, as you said, this guy was never a radical. He actually defeated the radical candidate in the primary named Daniel Hadaway, who's actually jailed right now on politically motivated charges, right? They've made up some kind of, corruption allegations, but the truth is it's a political prosecution. It's lawfare to try to get him marginalized so that he's not a candidate in this upcoming election. Chile doesn't have direct re-election. Gabriel Boric always positioned himself as a sort of a moderate left candidate. But it's obvious that he made a decision at the beginning of his term that he wasn't going to lean on the Chilean working class as its base. He was clearly aiming at support from imperialism to sustain himself in power. The guy couldn't even get the Constitution passed under his leadership. I mean, he's done such a terrible job. His approval ratings are, scraping the bottom of the barrel. And here's the curious thing. Do you know where he was when he was issuing these tweets criticizing Venezuela's democracy? In the UAE, the great monarchy that is the UAE. And he was praising, I'm the first Chilean president to travel to the UAE, and I've signed all these agreements. Wait, I thought you were the great Democrat. So where is the consistency there? So it's pretty absurd to see that kind of position, but that's always been his place. He knows, he's like, I'm going to pretend I'm a progressive, right? I'm going to actually do a very milquetoast job governing, but I'm going to use that perception to try to advance the interests of imperialism. And it's been really disappointing. And the other part that's disappointing is so much of this kind of soft, pseudo left that does exist in the United States that I'm very critical of, that was so excited by Gabriel Boric. They're like, oh, he's not like Diaz-Canel. He's not like Maduro. He's not like Ortega. He's a Democrat. And he's, he believes in human rights and all this kind of stuff. Go ask the Mapuche people if Gabriel Boric actually defends human rights, but they fell for it, right? They fall for it every time. You would hope that they would learn, right? That these kind of terms like authoritarianism and all this kind of stuff, they're the State Department speak. It's all used to advance an agenda that favors the interests of U.S. capital in particular in the region because they're losing their grip, right? Who is the major trading partner of most countries in Latin America today? It's not the United States anymore. It's China. And so there is that panic within the upper echelons of the United States government and, the ruling class in the United States about them losing their quote unquote backyard.
That was an amazing diss track on Gabriel Boric there. And also, I'm glad that you have the same critique of the same social democrats. I call them the NATO left now. They're the ones who were supportive of NATO. I think that's a good way to distinguish them. The Nina Turners, the Bernie Sanders. And I said, I predicted this literally even before. I said this tweet, just fucking around, I said, you already know Bernie Sanders and the squad is crafting the worst Venezuelan election tweets you're going to read. And of course, here's Bernie Sanders doing the job of the State Department to sow doubt. Now, to be clear, it's not the worst thing he ever said about Maduro. He called Maduro a tyrant. He criticized their election before. So this is tamer than I expected. But you guys think he's still doing the job of the State Department by casting this doubt. Venezuelans deserve free and transparent democratic elections. What are you implying here, Bernie? The full vote tallies from every polling station in the country must be released in line with Venezuelan law, and authorities must refrain from using force against peaceful protesters. The violent fascists we were just talking about who burn people alive. You got to see how he calling them peaceful protesters. So if you're not in the know, if you're like an average American, this tweet wouldn't even read that bad. But there's a lot of red flags with me. There are a lot of State Department justifying with me. Do you see the same thing? Am I overreading it, Jose?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like, who are you? You're a U.S. senator. Who are you to question another country's electoral system? Venezuela has its institutions. There is a procedure in place to verify the results. Let that be carried out. Let it happen. I mean, I'm based in Mexico. We had an election on June 2nd, so almost 2 months ago at this point, and still Claudia Sheinbaum is not officially the president-elect because there's a process that has to be followed, right? There's a revision that has to be held. The Electoral Authority has to actually hold a meeting and officially declare. It's likely to happen not for another month, right? Or at least a couple of more weeks, maybe sooner. But the point is that these processes take time. You have to respect these institutions. we used this word earlier today on this program, sovereignty. That's the name of the podcast that Kirk Hackbarth and I do about Mexico, Soberanía. It's important to respect the sovereignty of other countries and allow their institutions to proceed at their pace. And they're also under attack, right? We've hearing reports of, malfeasance, hacking, attempts to interrupt the actual official count that's happening, right? So they're no position to tell us what to do when it comes to our elections. Not to mention the fact that the US is not even a democracy. How is it possible that somebody who participates in the US political system, where the Electoral College is still a thing, thinks that they have the authority to lecture other countries about, the transparency of their results? It's absurd. How many times have we seen the popular vote actually not reflect the person who ends up getting elected because of the Electoral College? Come on, this is absurd. It's the 21st century. They should be minding business in their own house and actually try to engage in a serious reform of their system.
That's such a great point, and that's why it's extremely important to pay attention to foreign policy, because you can see the contradictions that these people have as a fearmonger over January 6th. Bernie Sanders, he's okay with January 6th protesters being locked up. I'm not for the prison state. I find that shit kind of weird, man. I'm against locking up people, even if you disagree with them. We have a prison state, and they locked up these people who I disagree with for protesting. They thought the election was fraudulent. You don't have to agree with them, but they protested at the Capitol. And as anyone who's an abolitionist who care about criminal justice, how can you justify locking these protesters up? Bernie Sanders is okay with that. Why? Because according to Bernie, they did the crime of questioning an election and protesting that. The same thing he okay with locking Americans up for. He's cheering on the opposition that's doing way worse than the drunk rednecks who went on a tour of the Capitol. They was unarmed. Where's the story of the January 6th rioters burning people alive? And to your point regarding democracy, I make this point on the show all the time. You can predict who wins an election at around a 97% rate based on who raised the most money. AIPAC just bragged about 90 out of 90 of the Democratic primaries election cycles they had the winning candidate, 100% rate. This is not a democracy. This is a capitalist dictatorship in action. So this is the critique I have of Bernie, and this is what he does to enable imperialism. This is the critique I have of social democrats in general, which I used to consider myself a I used to be like, man, I'm a Democrat socialist. Then I realized that it was a tool of imperialism. Their ideology is a tool of imperialism, which goes to Gabriel Bort's tweet. And I want to ask you about AMLO because for my analysis, and I'm curious to see where you stand. My analysis of AMLO, because most of Mexican presidents have to have a friendly relationship with the United States, you can't expect them to be rebellious against the United States. You're neighbors to the most violent empire, one of the biggest economies ever. You can't expect the Mexican president to be some anti-imperialist revolutionary. So with that said, I heard AMLO was a leftist, but I wasn't a side. Like, whatever, he's a Mexican president. It is what it is. AMLO been pleasantly surprising to me on the empire front. He called out the United States for the Cuban embargo, called for the release of Julian Assange, been critical of the NATO war, been critical of the genocide in Palestine. Now he is standing up for Venezuela. This is surprising to me. AMLO been a surprise just on the foreign policy front, been a very pleasant surprise, been very critical of the U.S. state regime. What is your take? Because you know more than I would. I think you said you reported Mexico City. Also very curious about your take on AMLO as well. I'll read the headline because not everyone's watching. So the headline I have up here is Mexican president says no evidence of fraud in Venezuela election. So I'll pass to you, Jose. I know you have plenty of thoughts, and we will begin to wrap up here very soon. But I definitely got to have you back on.
Sure. Anytime. So just before I get into that, I will say that I used to identify as a progressive too. And you know what changed my mind? Visiting Venezuela and seeing the masses participating and transforming their society, protagonist place in that transformation. And so that's when I started to identify with revolutionary thinking and struggle and Marxism and all the rest. But yeah, I mean, AMLO has been very good on Venezuela. In fact, has been subject to, the usual mainstream media smears as a result of it. He embraced Maduro as one of, the members of the Latin American community in a way that his predecessor didn't. Enrique Peña Nieto, who was president before López Obrador and was the last kind of neoliberal regime president before the transformation here in Mexico, he was one of the key figures in the Lima group, which sought to engage in regime change in Venezuela. There was, of course, the Guaidó, self-proclaimed interim president in 2019 when he, raised his hand in that plaza and declared himself, the interim president. And I always mention this anecdote because as somebody who follows Venezuela very closely and being based here in Mexico, I was eager to see how Mexico would respond. And it was really worrisome at some point because, it was obvious that there had been a coordinated strategy. This had been planned beforehand, that a bunch of countries in the region were going to say, no, we also recognize Juan Guaidó. We don't recognize Maduro anymore, to kind of that sense of momentum, to drive that narrative. And there was a very important moment that happened from the president's office here in Mexico. We said, no. And Mexico's a big player in the region. When Mexico said, no, we're not going to play this game, we're not going to recognize Guaidó, we have relations with the democratically elected government of Venezuela, which is Nicolás Maduro, I think it worked to kind of slow that momentum and possibly stop that from consolidating and actually becoming an actual successful regime change operation. And so that was very early in López Obrador's term. López Obrador also rescued CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which was created by the Bolivarian Revolution of the leadership of Hugo Chavez as a different forum aside from the OAS, the Ministry of Colonies, as we call it in Latin America, which only seeks to advance the interests of U.S. imperialism in the region. It is not the kind of body that purports to be about, defending human rights and democracy. Luis Almagro actually, he's still the Secretary General, was recently holding a meeting, I think today, around Venezuela. But this is not a fair actor in this process. He called for a military invasion of Venezuela when the whole Guaidó show was happening. He was there during that stupid concert that they held on the border between Colombia and Venezuela. So, he has been critical of the OAS. He was very critical of the OAS in this case over the last few days, has been saying they are not the people who should be intervening on this. Obviously, they already had, a player in the game and they were pro Edmundo Gonzalez. They are pro opposition. That's not something that is even controversial. It's widely recognized. They do it under the guise of saying that they defend democracy again, but we've already explain why these aren't actually democracy defenders in any sense. And so, in other places, he's also been quite good when it comes to the defense of sovereignty, right? Fiorella mentioned Peru, where Pedro Castillo was ousted in a parliamentary coup, right? Where he's jailed right now. He's being held by the illegitimate Boullarte regime there. And of course, he was the first one calling for him to be released, to be restored to power. And in fact, before he was detained, Pedro Castillo was on his way to the Mexican embassy to receive asylum because Mexico plays that role. It did it with Ecuador as well, protecting the interests of a legitimate political actor in that country. There's been this awful campaign. I lived a couple of years in Ecuador under the presidency of Rafael Correa. Ecuador is in a very difficult spot today, but it wasn't that way a few years ago. But there's been this relentless persecution of all the Correístas, as they're known, the Citizens Revolution supporters there, and he has played a key role there. In fact, there was a huge diplomatic incident between Mexico and Ecuador because the current president, this immature baby who doesn't know how to govern whatsoever, he's literally the son of the richest man in Ecuador, ordered the invasion of the Mexican embassy in order to kidnap Jorge Glass, the former vice president of Rafael Correa. And so we had to break diplomatic relations because, that technically is an act of war, right? The sovereign territory of Mexico, of the Mexican embassy. And of course, I called it a kidnapping because it is not an arrest when it happens on territory you don't control. And so they went in there and they literally kidnapped the former vice president, again, as part of the persecution. And López Obrador has been very consistent on that. And we've taken actually Ecuador to the World Court over this. So on foreign policy, like you said as well, on Cuba, he's been great. In fact, Cuba awarded him the most prestigious medal because of their defense. And to bring this back to the United States, because I think it's also important to talk about this. This is something that's rarely mentioned. Obviously, there's a very big part of this election cycle has been the issue of migration, right? And I think we always need to stress that migration is driven in many ways by U.S. foreign policy, right? Where you can just kind of follow the trends. Whereas a few years ago, when the U.S. was backing a corrupt narco dictatorship in Honduras, most of the migrants came from Honduras. Now that they're applying this brutal, murderous sanctions regime against Venezuela, they mostly come from Venezuela, but also Cuba, which is suffering under a decades-long blockade. And López Obrador has been one of the most consistent voices on saying, you want to do something about migration? End the blockade of Cuba, and the sanctions against Venezuela, and the sanctions against Nicaragua, right? This is something that's rarely talked about in these kinds of conversations around migration, but he's been really good about this. And it's unfortunate because we're talking about an important, popular head of state who's mentioning this on a consistent basis, but that doesn't get any play in mainstream media in the United States, right? It's always like, oh, these migrants, they're just fleeing, right? They're just coming here, invading us, et cetera, et cetera.
You know how many segments I watch? I've seen a few in prep for my shows on corporate media where they talk about Venezuela. I'm talking about 8 to 10 minute segments, and they wouldn't say the word sanction once. I have not. I've seen 2 of them. I didn't have time to include it in one in my shows. I was going to, but I didn't have time. Entire segment talking about Venezuela, not once mentioned something that is extremely significant like sanctions. The United States sanctions currently 1/3 of the world's population. You guys know that? And now it's biting the West in its ass. What the world been watching, what the West did to Venezuela. They see what the response to Russia and the Ukraine war was, and now there's a big push for de-dollarization and BRICS. And this will be my last question, because I'm interested in your perspective on this, because you're very familiar with politics in the entirety of the global south. So I want to get your question on this, because Lula is a big advocate of BRICS, and you see a big push for BRICS for the exact same reason you were just talking about, the sanction regime, which is why I would never be critical of Maduro of Venezuela. Even before I knew that much about it, I'm like, dude, what? We sanctioned their country to death. Even as a dumb social democrat, I knew that. It was like, why were you, like, he already going against the empire. He got these sanctions, so I'm not going to go after him. He got a lot going on with him. So I want you to discuss the sanction regime, the push for de-dollarization, and where you think it's going from your point of view.
Yeah, I want to invite people who are watching and listening to check out VenezuelaAnalysis.com. It's one of the issues we cover very, very deeply. We actually wrote a book about it. We published it called The War Without Bombs, the analysis of the political, economic, and social impact of sanctions. And you can see everything there. It's free to download. You can check it out now. But obviously, we have rolling coverage of sanctions in particular. I think it's important to lay out just what it means, because oftentimes they try to say, oh, no, you know, this is just against the regime officials, or we have exemptions for food and medicine and things like that. What is in place today is the same, basically, for all intents and purposes, the same maximum pressure campaign that was created by Elliott Abrams and Bolton and Trump when they were in the White House, which was about strangling the Venezuelan economy to make the population desperate for any kind of relief. Kind of the same strategy they applied against Nicaragua in the 90s to have the opposition elected there before, the return of the Sandinistas in the 21st century. And so we have to remember, Venezuela's number one commodity is oil, but oil is controlled internationally by the United States. Trade is largely done in US dollars. And so that's where they're able to apply to turn the screws to make it virtually impossible to sell oil on the international market. And so what they have to do is go through intermediaries. They literally sometimes have to take boats into the middle of the ocean and trade the actual commodity in the seas in order to kind of circumvent all of these sanctions. And obviously that means they receive less income. It means that they open themselves up to corruption. There was a major corruption scandal in the state-owned oil company in Venezuela where, it makes very, very challenging for Venezuela to benefit from its number one commodity. And actually, since they've adapted their economy and they're doing much better today than they were, in 2019, 2020, when the maximum pressure campaign was applied against them. They've developed food sovereignty initiatives to try to not have to depend on imports and things like that. But there's a lot of other things, right? Like, it's the Venezuelan oil industry was built up hand in hand with the U.S. oil industry. That's why Citgo, the asset that is technically owned by the Venezuelan people, is in Texas. But the problem is also many of the pieces to repair their refineries and to be able to actually engage in extraction and production of oil are not available to them because they're not able to buy them from the United States. So this brings me to your point about the need for a multipolar world, why Venezuela is enthusiastic about initiatives like BRICS, why it's so close to China. China and Venezuela have, it's called an all-weather relationship. they use the language that the Chinese use about a very deep, long-lasting, positive relationship, which is important because you have to have that alternative, right? The United States, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, became the only global superpower, even though that's an imprecise term, and used that dominance to really kind of extend its tentacles. Well, we're in a different era now, where we've seen the rise of China, we've seen the rise of initiatives like BRICS, where it's important to have those alternatives so that you don't have to only rely on the US and its allies in Western Europe. And so Venezuela is a big, big proponent of that, and advancing that, the de-dollarization of the world, to engage in trade without having to rely on the US dollar. And unfortunately, to bring it back to Mexico, we're in a tough spot. Like you said, we border the United States. López Obrador has said that he wants to maintain a positive economic relationship with the United States because it does benefit us. Of course, it is helpful to have on your border, a wealthy nation that buys your exports. But of course, without making it seem like we don't depend on them, I do want to say that they depend on us too. Right? They need our labor, they need our resources and things like that. So it's not like it's a totally, upside down relationship where we're totally, subservient to the interests of the United States. There is an exercise of sovereignty here as well. And I think it's important to remember. We'll see what happens in the US election, but I think it's worth remembering that the Republican Party, and not just Donald Trump, but the party itself, there is now a mainstream idea that it's legitimate to engage in unilateral military action against Mexico, to actually either bomb or send troops on the ground. Just the other day, Trump talked about sending kill teams to take out the cartel leaders inside of Mexico. That's an affront to our sovereignty. And that's not something that this government will ever stand for. So like I said, under López Obrador, one of the pillars has been the defense of national sovereignty. And it's not just rhetoric, right? It's about rescuing our state-owned oil company, Pemex. It's about having food sovereignty. It's about having sovereignty when it comes to security policy. All of this has been a very, very important thing. One of the biggest demonstrations in recent years here in Mexico, we're talking about 500,000 people on the streets, was to commemorate the expropriation of the oil industry here in Mexico in the 30s. And it was also an exercise in defending Mexican sovereignty today. And there's this great banner where it showed an image of Lázaro Cárdenas, who expropriated the oil industry, of López Mateos, who nationalized the electricity industry, and López Obrador, who nationalized our lithium here in Mexico, to say that these resources need to be to the benefit of the Mexican population. And we've seen it, right? We've had a massive expansion of social programs, direct cash transfer programs. There's a reason why Claudia Sheinbaum was elected in this last election on the landslide. She actually got more votes than López Obrador did in 2018, right? It's just a monumental mandate. That's because people are understanding that, yes, this is a better way of organizing our economy. But in the face of these threats, the United States should be aware that we will not tolerate any unilateral military action here. And if they dare to do that, the consequences will be far reaching. Like I said, yeah, we have a positive relationship. Mexico's actually has displaced China and Canada as the #1 trading partner of the United States. You need us as much as we need you. And if you go through with this terrible idea of attacking us, then there's going to be consequences, very, very serious ones. Like your economy won't work without Mexican inputs. So be very careful about what's happening there. And if it does come to pass, again, I want to insist on this, we need to strengthen the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement. I've been deeply inspired to see the way that with the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people in Palestine by the Zionist entity, that there we've seen, the courageous young people mostly saying that we will not tolerate this. I think there's been a qualitative shift in the consciousness of the USian people. And I think we need to extend that beyond, right? Not just to resist the genocide, but also resist US imperialism more broadly, right? The Zionist entity is able to do what it does because of US imperialism, because of the support of the arms that are coming from the US, from the UK and other countries, from Germany, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if the US tries to do something against Mexico, we need the same kind of mobilization to say, we will not tolerate this. We will not tolerate bombs dropping on civilian populations, right? I always make this kind of tongue-in-cheek comment. They talk about bombing the drug labs. Do they think that these drug labs have big billboards on the top of the buildings like, hey, we make drugs here? No, they're in the middle of civilian populations. People will die as a result, and we cannot stand for that. Why? All because the US refuses to treat addiction as a public health issue and tries to criminalize everything, thinks that's the solution to everything. No. And so you also know that here in Mexico, there is a well-organized, militant, active population that has been politicized over the last few years that understands the situation in the world as well. And I think that we should have more exchanges, people-to-people exchanges between the working classes and the campesinos of Mexico with the working class of the United States, to understand that we're not enemies. Our enemies are in Washington. They're not here, in Tijuana on the border.
Yeah, well said. I'm quickly becoming a fan of Venezuela analysis. It was great having you on, and there's so many great things you said. Unfortunately, I only have time for an hour today. We definitely got to have you back on. I got to have a panel with the amazing crew at Venezuela Analysis. And also, there's so many things we can talk about. I definitely want to dive a lot more into Mexican politics. And I'm glad that you shared the ambition that I've been talking about since the early days of the channel, since the Fred Hampton leftist days, of having an international leftist, an international anti-imperialist coalition. You guys remember my international leftist coalition panels, right? With Bedbeat Media Boys, Assad Rod, Josana from Brazil. They was the Bedbeat Media Boys. They still do great work out of Beijing and China. And that's my dream, my ambition. This is why I condemn the Bernie left, who's willing to sell out the global working class on the devil's bargain that they may get crumbs on domestic policies. So they want to support coups, they want to support genocide, they want to support NATO, they want to support wars. You have Ilhan Omar who endorsed the guy who bombed her country. Yeah. They do that because they make a devil's bargain. They want to sell out the left in the world, the global working class, in order to get meager gains for the working class in the United States, which is a failed strategy in the first place. We reject our ideology. We call for an international leftist coalition, and we need to become conscious with our brothers and sisters across borders and across the oceans as well. So always great to have you on. We got to have you back on very soon.
Yeah, so check out VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And for those of you who are interested in Mexico as well, check out MexicoSolidarity.com. It's initiative. My elevator pitch is always it's Venezuela analysis, but for Mexico. So it's something we're working on here to cover the Soberania podcast. We post that every Tuesday, sometimes on Monday as well. So check us out, MexicoSolidarity.com and VenezuelaAnalysis.com.
Yeah, so Zoya, I see you're here, Zoya. I know you're here. So you got the news. That's what we got to work on, the Venezuela analysis panel. So that's going to be a banger. Another banger show. We also have Savvy and the JB show tomorrow, Thursday, normal time. We had John Pang on today. We had a double header, banger. Jose Luis, amazing analysis from him. We have Fiorello on, longtime friend. Banger after banger in this new era. Thank you guys for watching. Have a good day.